The perception is actually not the reality, particularly when it comes to the claims of election fraud. In fact, it was the Conservative Heritage Foundation that did an exhaustive study on this going back all the way to the 1980s and pointed out that there's only 100 total instances of non-citizens voting. Again and again, part of the problem with election integrity is that President Trump keeps accusing election systems of not being fair and not being secure, but there's actually no evidence to support that. So don't you need to bring to the American people a suite of issues, a suite of evidence that demonstrates this need? Just give me one example of where there was some level of fraud that the Save America Act would have prevented that would have altered an election.
Yeah, Ryan, I guess we just look at this differently. I think, again, I'm going back to that an election process needs to be trustworthy, that the election process is important to the backbone and the survival of this nation.
I mean, he's just asking for one example, just one. It's not how you look at it differently. It's just one example. And that, again, Roger Marshall of Kansas yesterday, unable to give any specific example of voter fraud Trump's voting bill would have prevented. It comes as testimony from the Postmaster General last week, raising concerns about the Trump administration's crackdown on mail-in voting. We're going to dig into all of that. Plus, we'll look at the long-term impact of New York's primary elections and whether the Mamdani-backed candidates are a sign of where the Democratic Party is headed. There's a little debate going on there. Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It's Monday, June 29th. With us, we have President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass. He's author of the Substack Home and Away. CEO and co-founder of Axios, Jim Vandehei is here. Politics Bureau Chief and Senior Political Columnist at Politico, Jonathan Martin is here. And MSNOW National Affairs Analyst John Heilman. He's partner and chief political columnist at Puck. Good to have you all on board with us this morning. There is a lot to get to on this Monday morning. After days of renewed hostilities, the United States and Iran have agreed to end the back-and-forth fighting around the Strait of Hormuz and resume peace talks to end the 5-month war. That's according to the Wall Street Journal, citing officials from the U.S. and other countries involved in the negotiations. A senior Trump administration official tells MSNOW that technical talks are on track for the coming days as planned. This potential cooling comes after the two sides traded strikes again late last week and throughout the weekend, stemming from efforts to reopen the strait without Iran's oversight. A multinational maritime body overseen by the U.S. Navy said it would expand a route near Oman for inbound and outbound traffic. Iran then attacked vessels going through a route near the Omani side, prompting the U.S. military to retaliate. Tehran later hit back by launching drone and missile attacks targeting U.S. assets in Bahrain and Kuwait as the country's foreign minister reiterated the claim that Iran alone has the authority to govern the strait. So who's agreeing on what here? Meanwhile, fighting in Lebanon continues to threaten any lasting regional peace deal, with Hezbollah's leader saying the group reserves the right to defend our homeland and people and will not stop until Israel withdraws from Lebanon. So, Richard Haass, is there really a peace deal? Is this over, or are we just sort of getting by as things pop up?
There is no peace. There's not even a robust ceasefire. What you have is a vaguely worded MOU, and the sort of thing you just talked about, Mika, the idea that there was several days of violence in the Strait of Hormuz. It'll die down and then it'll pop up. Iran wants to have long-term influence over, control over the Strait of Hormuz, its most potent weapon. And one has to assume that periodically, almost like station identification, Iran is going to pop up and assert it. In Lebanon, you have a deal between Israel and the government of Lebanon that leaves out Hezbollah. So that's not a peace deal, and we can go around the region. But no, in order to have peace, you need to have not only a balance, but you have to have a joint willingness, a joint commitment to it. And you don't have it. You don't have either a military balance right now, and you certainly don't have a joint commitment. So stop, start, whatever metaphor you want to use, but the one word we ought not to use is peace. This is not a peace deal.
Yeah, and I'm going to get back to you, Richard, with more on this, but it's also rinse and repeat over and over again, the same story. And I just wonder, John Howman, looking at the politics of this as well as the foreign policy. I mean, President Trump accused Iran of violating the ceasefire and says these incredibly extreme statements like this, you know, the republic will cease to exist. He said it before. At what point do these threats prove to be not only illegitimate because he doesn't follow through on them, but it shows Iran repeatedly mocking and humiliating anything the President of the United States says?
Mika, I think we reached that point a while ago. If you're asking whether the threats have started to ring hollow and that most of Iran's actions reflect a sense that they don't believe that the president's threats, the most existential of them, are going to come to pass anytime soon, and because they understand that the president is operating according to a timetable and under the pressures of the midterm elections. And Richard, I guess that's the question I wanted to turn back to you, which is, you know, you hear more and more people who are close to this process and people who are watching it with the greatest kind of care that what they imagine happening here is these tenuous ceasefires going, not just kind of being in place for the rest of the 60 days from the MOU, but being extended kind of indefinitely out into the future to carry both sides through November at a minimum, and that then we'll actually maybe start to see some kind of change in the dynamics of the conflict, and that Iran is worried about precisely that in the long run, that what President Trump will do is to start to wage war in a more serious way, a more aggressive way against them again, once he gets past the midterm election day. What do you hear on that front, and how plausible do you think some of those kind of long-running, endless war scenarios are as we sit here now?
Look, it's quite possible. I've heard that. In some ways, what we're talking about is almost the difference between a stop, start, and what you talked about is the intensity of resumed warfare. So either way, I think we're not looking at peace. We're not looking at a strong ceasefire. We're looking at intermittent violence. But the question is, how high is the violence? The problem for the United States is reclosing the strait, even if it's after the midterms, causes enormous economic hardship. Plus, as we saw in the last 24 hours, strikes against Bahrain and Kuwait show the real vulnerability of the region. That's Iran's, Iran has two massive pieces of leverage here. One is strait closure. The other is to hit the energy or water infrastructure of its neighbors. And even though it would make itself vulnerable in the course of doing that, the implications for the region and the world would be calamitous, far worse, actually, than anything we've seen to date. So the resumption of significant hostilities after November, I'll be honest with you, John, I don't see where it gets us anyplace better. I just don't see the logic. If more military force would have worked, we would have done it already. And everything we've done hasn't brought us to success. So I don't see where doing it after November changes the bottom line here.
All right, we're going to get back to this. We have a lot of news to cover this morning. The death toll is growing in Venezuela this morning following two back-to-back earthquakes last week. Officials say nearly 1,500 people are dead, more than 3,000 injured, and up to 50,000 people are registered as missing. The earthquakes were centered around a coastal city about 25 miles north of Venezuela's capital of Caracas and destroyed dozens of buildings. Acting President Delcy Rodriguez said yesterday that rescue and recovery efforts remain ongoing. While the first 72 hours after an earthquake are the most critical for finding survivors, there are still rescues happening throughout the weekend. U.S. rescue crews helped pull this man from the rubble. Meanwhile, some Venezuelans are expressing frustration with what they say is the country's inadequate and disorganized response. Many international rescue crews were held up for hours by airport authorities, while one Spanish crew disbanded after waiting for 2 days at the airport. And volunteers who were praised for their help were also prevented access to some sites due to the government limiting street access. School classes remain suspended for one more week, while electricity supply has only been restored to 75% of the area. A senior U.S. official announced yesterday that a financial package to help Venezuela could be announced early this week. We'll turn now to politics here at home. After his endorsed candidates swept their Democratic congressional primaries, New York City Mayor Zoran Mamdani says his Democratic Socialist positions can win over voters nationally.
Can a Democratic Socialist get elected president?
I think a Democratic Socialist can get elected anywhere across this country for any position. What I think we need to bring is a focus on working people.
And that's the direction that the party should go in terms of selecting a candidate for 2028.
I think the direction that the party should go in is how best to fight for working people. I think we need to have a platform and a vision that doesn't sound as if it was cooked up by consultants, but instead one that you would say in response to someone who's asking, why can't I afford my rent? Why can't I afford my groceries? Why can't I afford my childcare? We need to make clear who we stand for, how we're going to stand for them, and that we're actually willing to fight for them when the going gets tough.
Okay, so those comments come after 32-year-old Democratic Socialist Arieliza Avila Chevalier beat incumbent Congressman Adriano Espaillat. But Chevalier has been facing scrutiny over previously articulated stances and numerous social media posts that she has since deleted. And her appearance at a rally the day after Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023, where attendees reportedly suggested the attack was justified. In a now deleted social media post between 2018 and 2022, multiple posts, Chevalier also used expletives to refer to former Vice President Kamala Harris and the Democratic National Committee, and expressed support for abolishing police, prisons, and borders, as well as seizing private property and calling into question Israel's right to exist. Other reports noted she called former President Joe Biden a rapist and disparaged white people in some of her posts. Chevalier has said she regrets the posts, adding that she has, quote, grown considerably since writing them. Some Democrats have pushed back against her past comments, while others, like Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, appeared to dodge these concerns.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not super familiar with that race. All I'm saying is that this party has to have a real contest of ideas. And I just don't think that our defense of incrementalism has worked. So I don't mind a contest of ideas. And I just don't know that we have had it to the extent that voters have been satisfied. Listen, it's no secret. Voters aren't super happy with establishment Democrats or establishment Republicans these days. I will say, though, what binds together, I think, every Democratic candidate that is running, including the ones in New York, is that they are standing up to protect American democracy. And right now, the biggest threat to this country are not a handful of House candidates in New York.
So Joe reacted to that response, posting on X, quote, yeah, well, I mean, I'm not super familiar with that race. This is what frightened Republicans do when confronted with the horrid things Donald Trump has said. Now Democratic senators are saying this about a congressional candidate who accused Joe Biden of rape. Stop now. His memo to Democrats: call out crazy even when it's on your side, especially when it's on your side. Voters will reward you for being better than Republicans. I have to say, J-Mart, this is going to be an interesting issue, actually, for candidates on both sides of the aisle, because they're now, many of them are old enough to have past tweets and ridiculous statements. And voters are going to have to decide what the line is. What's the deal breaker? In this case, I think it's pretty clear. Some of these statements are complete deal breakers, and it's not hard to say. It's just not hard to say. And one of the most frustrating thing about Trump's first presidency and his second, and folks who chose to vote for Trump the first time and then vote for him a second time and then act shocked about the cruelty of the mass deportations, or to act shocked about the tariffs, or to say, well, I haven't been watching the news, I don't know about that one. That is like the most gaslighting experience one can ever see throughout this entire political cycle or cycles, because pretending you haven't seen it is impossible. It's an out. And now to see a Democrat doing it, and we both love Chris Murphy. We think he's a great guy and serves our country. But don't gaslight people. I mean, this story's out there. And what is, what is the line of past tweets being deal breakers?
Well,
this candidate, by the way, 32 years old.
Well, and that's key here. So you're talking about somebody who was in their early to mid 20s, not terribly long ago, who probably lives online like everybody of that generation does, and is, growing, politically maturing and saying things that they would probably, cringe at now. But when they were 21, 22, maybe it didn't seem as crazy in the heat of the moment. But of course it does now when you're a candidate for the U.S. Congress. Look, I think both parties would rather focus on the excesses of the other than do accountability or policing on their side. Chris Murphy wants to talk about the decline of the establishment of both parties, how his party has not been able to meet the moment politically. And so that's what he wants to focus on. When you put in his face a candidate who wants to ban borders and prisons and calls Biden a rapist, it's kind of embarrassing. And you know what? It's the same as the Republicans. It's embarrassing for them when they're told that Trump is talking about the reflecting pool or calling somebody horse face or whatever. It's just humiliating for them, and they'd rather focus on the other, because that's the order of the day in American politics now. It's tribalism, and it's about the excesses of the other, real and perceived. And if you're not talking about that, boy, you don't want to stay on it. You want to focus on the other guys and how they're crazy, not police your own side. But Mika, you're right. You got to do accountability on your own side, because if you don't, guess what? It's not going away. And the other party is going to jam you and your fellow colleagues over it by throwing those comments against you and tarring your entire party. Look at last week. You have candidates saying, I don't know about Trump, but I can't support a party that's for banning prisons and borders. Well, the Democratic Party is not for banning prisons and borders. But of course, that comment is going to be thrown in the face of other candidates down the road if you don't have some kind of internal policing.
Okay, and Jim Vandehei, Chevalier might have told the Times a few weeks ago that she wouldn't jail murderers. But, I'm not following. I don't know about that, because I haven't been following it at all. So, therefore, I can just throw it away, and we don't have to talk about it. Instead of say, you can't say that. That is a ridiculous statement. That's not what I support. Let's talk about affordability.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest, why the senator says that and why most of the Democratic leaders are saying what they say. They're extremely unpopular. People do not like the Democratic Party any more than they like Donald Trump. And I'd be really worried if I were a Democratic leader. This is not just a Mandami thing. This is not just a couple of races in New York. Look at D.C., look at Seattle, look at Minneapolis. Watch that race in Wisconsin. Watch the races in Colorado. They are having their Tea Party moment. They are having their Trump moment. You have this base of very well-organized people who are just ticked off. They feel like the Democratic leadership is just bad, that they're weak, that they don't lead them where they want to be led. And when that happens, you can fill the void with people who often have really wacky ideas. That's not new to politics. It might be new to Democrats that they're now seeing the socialists getting elected. I think this is the beginning of a movement. This isn't just a moment in time. Look at those polls. Look at the number of people, not just young. It used to be young people. Now it's young and old who are Democrats who like socialism more than capitalism. We can debate whether they could tell you exactly what socialism is, but they like it. They like the energy. They like the sort of rage against the democratic machine. And I think this is going to be a defining topic going into 2028. And if you think that they won't elect a socialist, you're not paying attention to what's happening in America and what's happening on the ground at the base level of the Democratic Party.
There's a lot more to talk about here, because that in itself is a debate. Still ahead, we'll come back to it. Still ahead on Morning Joe, House Speaker Mike Johnson tries to sell the president's controversial elections bill with falsehoods. while Vice President J.D. Vance looks to defend Trump's false and repeated voter fraud claims. We'll show you those remarks and what they might mean for the midterms.
Here's my deal breaker for your side. Okay. Under Trump, you guys have two outcomes that an election can be. Either we win or they cheated. That has to stop. And the person who...
Look, I don't think that we should not concede elections, but I don't think that's what's going on. I think that if you go back to the president's core argument, he was making an argument about problems that exist in 2020. And here's the problem that I'm most focused on. The president and I have talked a lot about this, and I think we share a perspective here, but set to the side the stuff that really gets you and your audience very angry about whether the count was legitimate in Georgia or Pennsylvania or any of these other states. Is it true that large technology companies, some of whom have financial interests that exist outside the United States of America, were they censoring information in the run-up to an election? And set to the side the stuff, again, the Georgia stuff, but
that was litigated. Dominion, the Fox News paid us.
I'm trying to make the more middle ground argument here. The biggest criticism I had of the 2020 election is that you had technology companies that were quite literally censoring negative information about the left and promoting negative information about the right. So in a fundamental sense, like if the First Amendment says that we have a free and open debate and then the American people judge based on that free and open debate, the sense in which I think the election in 2020 was rigged, I'm sorry, is that you had technology companies that were putting their thumb on the scale in a way that completely obliterated the real open exchange of ideas. Now, by the way, it didn't happen in 2024, but it happened in 2020 and it was a problem.
Vice President J.D. Vance on Real Time on Friday, essentially proving Bill Maher's point about the Republican Party. Meanwhile, Speaker Mike Johnson continues to push the president's voting bill. Here's how he tried to sell the legislation yesterday on Fox News.
Election integrity is critical. It's central. You know, we talk about preserving the republic. You got to have free and fair elections in order to do that. And we can't allow big blue states and crooked, Democrat governors to try to steal elections away from us. And this is a very important measure, a common sense one, again, that the American people believe in and encourage and support.
Speaker Johnson implying election fraud without any evidence. Joe reacted to that performance, writing on social media, quote, "Stop lying, Mike. You're embarrassing yourself. You were fine becoming speaker with the help of California congressmen elected the same way. Will you surrender the speaker's gavel and not allow California Republicans to be seated in January?" I didn't think so. John Hellman, can we talk about the Save America Act and how it saves America? Could you just explain, because it's exciting. Save America. I would think that sounds like good news. Tell us about it.
It's very exciting news, Mika. It saves America, and it saves America from a non-existent problem. I mean, that's starting there, right? We've already discussed this 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times over the course of the last 10 years, which is that everyone has looked for years and years, especially since 2016, 2020. We've had conservative outfits, liberal outfits, centrist outfits, every outfit in the world trying to find examples, proven examples of voter fraud, and we cannot find them. No one can attest to anything like a statistically significant amount of voter fraud that's ever been discovered in the United States. But the problem with the SAVE Act, Mika, is worse than that it's not just trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist, but the problem is that it is commonly referred to as a voter ID bill, but it's really not a voter ID bill. It's much more of a voter suppression bill than that. And I'll tell you what it does, right? It says that if you're a first-time registrant to vote, you can't just roll in and register to vote with a driver's license, which has been the kind of standard documentation that people have had in the past, because driver's licenses do not prove national citizenship. And that's the thing that the SAVE Act wants you to have to do. So you'd have to walk in with one of the following things: a U.S. passport, a birth certificate, a naturalization certificate, or some combination of those documents. I'd like to know how many people currently involved in on our panel right now have access to any of those documents. Many people don't have access to their original birth certificate. They don't have access to. They don't have a passport. Many of us do have passports, but a lot of people don't. So that's one set of problems. It also has created a series of concerns around married women who've changed their names, who would have a double problem here. Might have a birth certificate with their maiden name, but now changed their name legally to their husband's name. That would be a problem for them. And then finally, the last thing on the list here, which is the thing that people are starting to focus on intensely because of the statements of the U.S. Postmaster, is that the SAVE Act would get rid of almost all online and vote by mail, which is which we all know is one of Donald Trump's hobby horses. So to describe this bill as a voter ID bill, whatever you think of its other merits, it's not a voter ID bill in the traditional sense of what that is, which has always in the past basically been you need to show up with your driver's license. And people thought that in some respects was too onerous. This goes way beyond that and could have impacts not just on Democratic voters, but on Republican voters who have some of the same issues related to.
अंधेरी दीवारों में खुद को ढूंढता हूँ गए जो दिन सहाने थे उन्हीं को सोचता हूँ मैं तुम्हारे बिन ये मौसम भी बड़ा बेसर्द लगता है दिल का हर एक कोना अब बहुत ही दूर भरता है अंधेरी दीवारों में खुद को ढूंढता हूँ मैं ये जो दिन सुहाने थे उन्हीं को सोचता हूँ मैं तुम्हारे बिन ये मौसम भी बड़ा सर्द लगता है दिल का हर एक कोना बहुत ही दर्द भरता है मेरे साए भी मुझसे अब जुदा होने को कहते हैं तुझे खोने की राहों में ये आंसू बहने लगते कहाँ ढूंढूं मेरा वो साजो सामा तो मेरी हर एक तमन्ना तू मेरी रूह का मका तू लकीरों में नहीं लिखा जो तुमने ख्वाब देखा था कहानी में फकत एक गम ही लिखा था सितारों से भी पूछता है पता तेरा कहाँ होगा मगर खामोश है दुनिया कहाँ मेरा जहाँ होगा बस एक बार मुड़ के देख ले मेरी बेबसी की सूरत मुझे है आज भी तेरी वफा की सख्त जरूरत साए मेरे तन्हा सफर बस रह गया दर्द का असर साए मेरे तन्हा सफर बस रह गया दर्द का असर